Part 1. The Hook. London, autumn 1963. A senior officer of the British Secret Intelligence Service sat in a quiet room and reviewed the files on the men his country most wanted to find. Soviet agents burrowed inside the Western establishment. He knew the case histories cold. He knew the methods, the dead drops, the tradecraft, the names. He was very good at the work. He was, in fact, the best of his generation, charming, brilliant, endlessly liked, a man who had once stood in line to run the entire agency. He was also the man they were looking for. For 30 years, Harold Adrian Russell Philby, known to everyone from Cambridge dons to CIA chieftains, as Kim, had passed the innermost secrets of Britain and the United States to Moscow. He had done it while wearing the old-school tie, while drinking at the right clubs, while marrying and burying wives, while charming the men whose job it was to stop exactly what he was doing. He rose to the top of counter-espionage in British intelligence, the very department charged with hunting Soviet spies. The fox was not merely near the henhouse. The fox had been handed the keys, the ledger, and a commendation. The damage was almost beyond calculation. Networks rolled up. Agents parachuted to their deaths. Defectors betrayed before they could speak. Operations poisoned in the cradle. By the time the truth was fully understood, Philby had become the single most destructive traitor in the history of Western intelligence, and the most humiliating because he had never broken in. He had been invited. He was one of them. He had been raised, schooled, and clubbed into the ruling class, and he turned every advantage of that class into a weapon against it. How does a man become that? Not a mercenary, not a blackmail victim, not a coward bought with a suitcase of cash, but a true believer who gave his whole life, cheerfully, to a lie. To understand the traitor, you have to go back before the treason, to a clever boy with a famous father and a borrowed name, and to the year the killing in the streets of a foreign city made his choice for good. Part 2. The True Believer. He was born on the first day of 1912 in Ambala, in British India, and the name that stuck to him was not really his. His father, St. John Philby, called him Kim, after Kipling's boy who moved unseen between worlds and played the great game of empire and espionage. It was a joke that would age into prophecy. St. John Philby was himself a monumental figure, colonial officer, Arabist, desert explorer, later a convert to Islam, and an advisor at the court of Ibn Saud. He was famous, difficult, and domineering, a father who cast a shadow a son could spend a lifetime trying to escape or to match. The boy was sent home to be made into an Englishman. Westminster School, then in 1929 Trinity College, Cambridge. He arrived a shy young man with a stammer that never quite left him, and which in time he would learn to use, because a stammer makes a listener lean in, wait, forgive, and trust. Cambridge in those years was not a place of quiet cricket and port. It was a hothouse of politics. The Great Depression was throwing millions out of work. The hunger marches crossed England, and across the Channel fascism was rising, loud and armed and confident. To a serious, idealistic young man, the old order looked bankrupt and the democracies looked paralyzed. Communism offered what they did not: certainty, urgency, and a side to be on. By the time Philby took his degree in economics in 1933, he had become a committed communist, not as a pose, but as a conviction that would outlast everyone and everything else in his life. Then came Vienna, and the moment the idea became flesh. In 1933 and 1934, Philby went to Austria, into a country tearing itself apart. In February 1934, the authoritarian government moved to crush the socialist workers. The Schutzbund, the socialist paramilitary, rose, and the state answered with artillery fired into workers' housing blocks. Philby was there in the middle of it. He carried messages, moved money, helped hunted socialists slip out of the reach of the police. He saw men shot and hanged for their politics. This was not a seminar room argument anymore. It was blood in the snow, and it hardened him past the point of return. In Vienna, he also met Litzy Friedman, Alice Coleman by birth, an Austrian Jewish communist, older than he was, quick and brave, and already deep in the underground. They fell in together in the work, and then in love. And when the crackdown made Austria lethal for her, Philby married her in February 1934 to give her a British passport and get her out. He brought her back to London, a wife and a comrade, and with her came a door. For Litzy and her circle were known to Soviet intelligence. In London in 1934, a talent spotter named Edith Tudor Hart flagged the promising young Englishman with the impeccable background and the fervent secret faith. He was introduced to a man he knew only as Otto, in truth, Arnold Deutsch, a Soviet illegal, a gifted recruiter of idealists. Deutsch did not want a courier or a leaflet writer. He wanted the opposite. He asked Philby to do the hardest thing an idealist can do, to renounce, publicly and convincingly, everything he believed, to bury his communism so deep that no one would ever suspect it, and to spend years, decades if necessary, boring quietly into the British establishment until he stood at its heart. Later, Philby would answer to another controller, the formidable Theodore Mali. Moscow gave him a name for the files: Söhnchen, Sonny, the little son, and later Stanley. He said yes, and he was not alone. Around the same current, from the same university and the same conviction, Moscow was gathering a set of young Englishmen who would become the most famous spy ring of the century, the Cambridge Five: Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. 5 men of the ruling class who chose in secret to serve its enemy. Of them all, Kim Philby would climb highest, cut deepest, and last longest. But first he had to become someone else entirely. The true believer now had to build a mask so perfect that even the men who hunted his kind would look straight at him and see one of their own. Part 3. The Mask. The instruction from Moscow was as counterintuitive as it was ruthless. To serve the cause, betray the appearance of the cause. Philby dropped his visible communist friends and habits like a shed skin. He let the old comrades drift. He grew quiet about Litzy, whose politics were too well known, and the marriage that had once been an act of rescue became a liability to be managed and eventually set aside. In place of the young Red, he assembled a young reactionary. He joined the Anglo-German Fellowship, a pro-appeasement, Nazi-friendly society of respectable Englishmen who wanted accommodation with Hitler's Germany. He was seen at its dinners, cultivated its members, and let the world conclude that the earnest Cambridge socialist had grown up and grown sensible. It was a grotesque disguise for a man who had bled for the socialists of Vienna, and that was precisely why it worked. No one looks for a communist in a room full of Hitler's English admirers. Then he found the perfect trade for a spy: journalism. A reporter is paid to go where things are happening, to ask questions, to know important people, to travel with an alibi built in. And it was journalism that carried him to Spain and to the making of his legend. From 1937, Philby covered the Spanish Civil War as a correspondent for the Times from Franco's side. The lifelong communist filed dispatches from among the nationalists, the fascist allies, and did it so convincingly that Franco's people trusted him, and Franco himself decorated him. A man who had helped socialists escape the guns in Austria now wore a caudillo's ribbon. There was no better proof of loyalty to the right than a medal from Franco, and no deeper cover for a servant of Moscow. Spain gave him more than a medal. In December 1937, near Teruel, a shell struck the car in which Philby was riding with 3 other journalists. The 3 were killed. Philby walked away with a scratch and a piece of shrapnel, and a reputation forged in fire. In the mythology of war correspondence, the man who survives when the men beside him die becomes something close to charmed, brave, cool, blessed. Philby returned to London not as a suspect but as a star. the fearless right-wing reporter who had stared down death for the Times. The mask was no longer a disguise he wore. It had become a public identity, admired and above question. When the Second World War came, that identity opened the next door. In 1939 and 1940, he covered the British Expeditionary Force in France for the Times, close to the military, trusted by officers, another lap of respectable proximity to secrets. And then, in 1940, with Britain fighting for its life and its secret services hungry for clever, well-connected men, the door that Moscow had been waiting 7 years to open finally swung wide. Kim Philby was brought into the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. His friend and fellow Cambridge man, Guy Burgess, already inside, helped ease him in. He started in the world of Section D and the training of secret agents, and in 1941 he moved to Section 5, the counter-espionage arm, and specifically its Iberian subsection, covering the very ground, Spain and Portugal, where his cover had been built. Consider what had happened. A committed Soviet agent, recruited in 1934 and hidden in plain sight for 7 years, was now inside the innermost machinery of British intelligence, not as a clerk or a courier, but in counter-espionage, the branch whose entire purpose was to detect and destroy foreign spies. He had the charm that made powerful men adopt him, the stammer that made them trust him, the clubbable ease in the famous father's name, the war record, the medal from Franco, and a drink always ready for a colleague with something to say. Everyone liked him. No one suspected him. His Soviet masters had a source at the heart of the enemy's secret service, and the enemy did not know the source existed. He rose fast because he was good, and because good men vouched for him. And within that branch, there would soon be a new section formed to do one thing above all others: to watch, to counter, to hunt the Soviet Union and international communism. Someone able, trusted, and untouchable would be needed to run it. They were about to hand that job to the best man they had. They were about to put the hunting of Soviet spies into the hands of a Soviet spy. Part 4. The Fox in the Henhouse. The war had barely begun to turn when London handed Kim Philby the keys to the very door he had been built to unlock. It was 1944. The Soviet Union was still a wartime ally, but the men who ran British intelligence were already looking past Hitler to the shape of the peace, and they saw in Moscow the enemy of the coming age. So the Secret Intelligence Service created a new department to fight it, Section 9, the branch charged with anti-Soviet and anti-communist counter-espionage. Somebody had to run it. Somebody trusted, capable, unsentimental, with a clean record and the confidence of his superiors. They chose Philby. Consider the perfection of it. The Soviet penetration agent, recruited a decade earlier under the codename Sonchin, now carried on Moscow's books as Stanley, was placed in personal command of Britain's entire effort to hunt Soviet spies. The fox was not merely inside the henhouse. The fox had been appointed gamekeeper, handed the ledger of every hen, and asked to design the fence. Every report on suspected communists, every plan to recruit defectors, every scheme to seed agents behind the emerging Iron Curtain, every assessment of Soviet capability, it flowed across the desk of a man whose first loyalty had been sworn, and would remain sworn, to the NKVD. He did the job well. That was the terrible genius of Philby. He was good. Colleagues admired his diligence, his mastery of files, his easy authority. He built the section, staffed it, shaped its priorities, and in shaping the West's anti-Soviet strategy, he was in effect writing a strategy for Moscow to read in advance. He knew which lines of inquiry pointed towards Soviet networks, and he could steer them into the sand. He knew which of his own officers showed dangerous promise, and he could blunt them. Britain's counteroffensive against Soviet intelligence was being run, at its very inception, by Soviet intelligence. The scale of what passed through his hands is almost impossible to hold in the mind. Across his years of service, Philby fed Moscow a river of secret material. The figure most often cited is more than 900 documents, though the true toll of what he compromised runs deeper than any count of paper. He betrayed operations before they were launched. He betrayed the identities of agents. He betrayed the architecture of Anglo-American cooperation, the methods, the assumptions, the names. When the Kremlin's analysts wanted to know what the British were thinking, they did not have to guess. They could turn, in effect, to the man the British had chosen to think it. There is no cleaner expression of the whole betrayal than this appointment. Everything before had been preparation. Everything after would be consequence. In 1944, the machine was complete, a perfect instrument of treason, wearing the face of a loyal servant. Promoted for it, decorated for it, trusted with the deepest secret work the Crown had to offer. And Moscow understood exactly what it had. The question that would soon test Philby was not whether he could steal secrets. It was whether, when a man surfaced who could name him, he had the nerve to bury him first. Part 5. The Blood on the Ledger. The test came in September 1945, and it came in the form of a frightened man in Istanbul. His name was Konstantin Volkov, an NKVD officer working under diplomatic cover as a Soviet vice consul. Volkov wanted out. Quietly, through the British in Turkey, he offered to defect and to pay his passage with secrets. He promised to name Soviet agents operating inside Britain. Among them, he said, was one who held the post of head of a counter-espionage section in London. He was describing Philby. The offer traveled to London, and by a stroke of luck that Moscow could scarcely have arranged better, it landed on the desk of the very section that dealt with such matters. Philby got himself assigned to handle the Volkov case personally. Then he did two things. He warned Moscow at once, and he delayed arranging a leisurely journey out to Turkey, letting the days bleed away, giving the NKVD the time it needed. By the time British hands reached for Volkov, Soviet hands had already closed. He was drugged, wrapped, and carried onto a Soviet aircraft, stretchered aboard and flown to Moscow. He was never seen again. Whatever was done to him there, no one recorded for the West to know. Philby had saved himself in the only currency that mattered, the life of the man who could have destroyed him. It was the first entry in a ledger written in blood, and it would not be the last. By 1949, Philby had been posted to Washington, the crown jewel assignment, senior SIS liaison to the CIA and the FBI, the man who sat at the hinge of the Anglo-American secret alliance. He lunched regularly with James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's brilliant, spiraling chief of counterintelligence, trading confidences over long meals. Angleton pouring out the workings of American intelligence to a friend who carried every word to Moscow. Philby had access to Venona, the ultra-secret American program decrypting intercepted Soviet cables, the single most dangerous project in the world to a man in his position. He was reading the West's efforts to catch Soviet spies while being one of the Soviet spies they were trying to catch. And in Washington, he took part in murder on a scale. The operation was called Valuable by the British, Fiend by the Americans, a joint MI6 and CIA venture to topple Enver Hoxha's Stalinist regime in Albania, seen as the softest target in the communist bloc. The plan was to slip Albanian emigres back into their homeland by parachute and by boat, to raise a rebellion from within. Philby sat on the Anglo-American body that coordinated it. He knew the timings, the landing zones, the routes, and he told Moscow all of it. The men came down out of the sky and in from the sea into waiting arms. They were ambushed on arrival, as though the enemy had read the schedule, because the enemy had. Over the life of the operation, from 1949 into the early 1950s, hundreds were captured or killed. These were not counters on a map. They were real men, some of them exiles returning to fight for their country, walking into a trap whose spring had been set by a smiling English gentleman in a Washington office. Operation Valuable, Operation Fiend, it was a total, bloody, humiliating failure. And its failure had a source. The blood on the ledger deepened. Philby lived among his victims' hunters as one of them, respected, promoted in prospect, spoken of as a future chief of the service. But even as he stood at the summit, a machine of pure mathematics was turning far beneath him. In the intercepted cables of Venona, letter by broken letter, a name was forming, a Soviet source who had operated inside the British embassy in Washington at the close of the war. The cryptanalysts did not yet know his face. They knew only his code name, Homer. And the closer they came to him, the closer they came to Philby. Part 6. The Third Man. Homer was Donald McLean. By early 1951, the Venona evidence had narrowed to him, a British diplomat who had served in the Washington embassy in 1944 and 1945, now back in London, now unmistakably the source the Americans had been chasing through their decrypts. The net was drawing tight, and Philby, in Washington, could see every strand of it. McLean was a fellow member of the Ring, one of the Cambridge men bound to Moscow. If McLean were arrested and broke under questioning, the thread would not stop with him. It could run to Burgess. It could run to Philby himself. There was a further complication living under Philby's own roof. Guy Burgess, reckless, brilliant, catastrophically indiscreet, had been posted to Washington and had lodged in Philby's house, and had so disgraced himself that he was being recalled to London in disgrace. Philby saw the use in it. Burgess, going home anyway, could carry the warning to McLean that the game was up. It was arranged. Burgess sailed for England as Philby's messenger. What followed went half right and half catastrophically wrong. On 25th May 1951, McLean vanished from England, and Burgess vanished with him. Both men fled to the Soviet Union. McLean was meant to run. Burgess was not. Burgess bolting alongside him was a blunder that pointed like an arrow, and the arrow pointed at the man who had housed Burgess in Washington, who had befriended him, who had every reason to know his mind. If Burgess was a Soviet agent, what was Philby, his host and closest associate? Philby was recalled to London. Suspicion settled on him now with a weight that would never fully lift. The suspicion that he was the third man, the one who had tipped off the pair and sent them running before the trap could close. He was interrogated hard. Among his questioners was Helenus Milmo, a former MI5 lawyer known as Buster, a barrister's mind set loose to break him. Milmo pressed, circled, laid out the pattern of coincidence that surrounded Philby across a decade. The Volkov case that collapsed under his hand. The friendships, the timing, the fingerprints of a man always somehow present when secrets died. It was damning. It was persuasive. It was not proof. Philby, drawing on a slight stammer and a lifetime of nerve, gave the interrogators nothing they could take into a courtroom. There was no confession, no document, no witness who could stand and swear. And so, in 1951, he was made to resign from the Secret Intelligence Service, eased out with a payoff under a heavy cloud, but uncharged and unconvicted. The men who ran British intelligence believed, many of them, that they had a traitor in their midst. They simply could not prove it, and a part of them could not quite bring themselves to believe it of one of their own. For 4 years he lived in that shadow, half ruined, watched, suspected, sustained by quiet loyalties within the service that had cast him out. Then the shadow lifted in the most extraordinary way. In 1955, the affair broke into the open when the Labour MP Marcus Lipton rose in the House of Commons and named Philby aloud as the suspected third man. The accusation demanded an answer. On 7th November 1955, the Foreign Secretary, Harold Macmillan, gave it before the Commons, in words that would become notorious. I have no reason to conclude that Mr. Philby has at any time betrayed the interests of this country. With a single sentence from the dispatch box, the British establishment cleared its own. Days later, Philby completed the performance. At his mother's flat in London, he faced a crowd of reporters and cameras and delivered a masterpiece of controlled poise, relaxed, faintly amused, immaculately reasonable, calmly denying that he had ever been a communist, batting away the questions of the assembled press without the flicker of a guilty man. It was one of the great performances of the century, and it worked. He was publicly exonerated. The class had closed ranks around one of its own, because the alternative, that a man of his breeding, his schools, his clubs, could have served Moscow all along, was a thing the establishment found simply impossible to believe. He walked away clean, cleared in Parliament, absolved before the press, his guilt sealed inside files that could prove nothing. Soon the service that had expelled him would begin, quietly, to draw him back. A foreign posting, a fresh start in a warmer country, the useful old hand rehabilitated by degrees. As far as the public record and the British public were concerned, Kim Philby was an innocent man wronged by rumor. But innocence was a story, and stories can be tested. He had beaten the interrogators, beaten Parliament, beaten the press. The hunters, however, were not finished with him, and some of them had learned to wait. Part 7. The Last Winter. Beirut in 1956 was a city built for a man like him. The mountains came down almost to the sea, and the sea carried the traffic of every empire that had ever wanted the Middle East. Spies drank openly in the bars of the Hotel Normandy. Correspondents filed dispatches that read like intelligence reports, and intelligence officers filed reports that read like journalism. Into this warm confusion came Kim Philby, notebook in hand, accredited to The Observer and The Economist, a foreign correspondent rebuilding a broken career. It was the perfect cover. It was also, astonishingly, a second life handed to him by the very service that had cast him out. For that is the part the tidy version leaves out. The Secret Intelligence Service had forced him to resign in 1951. It had watched Harold Macmillan clear his name in the House of Commons in 1955. And then, in Beirut, SIS quietly took him back, not on the books, but as an agent, an informant, a man with a lifetime of contacts across a region Britain could not afford to lose. There were officers in London who had never stopped believing in him. They gave him money and questions to ask, and a reason to keep moving through the region's back rooms. And Philby, being Philby, resumed his other correspondence as well. The Soviets, wary but interested, made contact again. So there he sat, in the sunshine of the Lebanese coast, drawing two salaries from two intelligence services that were sworn enemies, filing his journalism on top of it all, a triple existence balanced on charm and nerve. It could not last. It only felt as though it might. The first crack came from the cold. In December 1961, a KGB officer named Anatoly Golitsyn walked into the American embassy in Helsinki and defected to the West. Golitsyn brought fragments, not a name, not a photograph, but a shape. He spoke of a ring of 5 agents recruited in Britain in the 1930s, young men of good family, bound together and to Moscow. 5. The word traveled through Western intelligence like a slow current, and where it passed, old files were pulled and old faces reconsidered. The second crack came from an old acquaintance. In 1962, a woman named Flora Solomon, who had known Philby for decades, spoke to MI5. Years before, back in the 1930s, Philby had tried to recruit her too, had spoken to her of secret work for the cause, of serving something larger than Britain. She had refused. Now, appalled by his pro-Arab journalism and the memory of what he had once asked of her, she told what she knew. A defector's shape, a friend's memory. Laid side by side, they did what a decade of suspicion had failed to do. They made the case conclusive. The man Macmillan had cleared on the floor of Parliament was, beyond serious doubt, a Soviet agent, and had been one for nearly 30 years. The question in London was no longer whether. It was who would go to Beirut and what he would be allowed to bring home. They chose Nicholas Elliot. There was a terrible symmetry in the choice. Elliot was not a stranger sent to interrogate a suspect. He was Philby's friend, one of his closest, a colleague who had stood by him, who had argued his innocence for years, who had staked his own judgment on the belief that Kim could not possibly be a traitor. Now that friend was sent across the world to tell him that the game was over. They met in a flat in Beirut in January 1963. What passed between them has been told and retold, but the essential thing is simple. Elliot confronted him, and Philby, who had denied everything for 12 years, who had faced down interrogators and a press conference and a foreign secretary, this time, before his friend, gave way. Not entirely, never entirely, but he confessed. A partial confession, admitting the shape of what he had done, the years of it, the betrayal. And on the table reportedly sat an offer: immunity in exchange for the full truth, every name, every operation, everything Moscow had bought over 30 years. And then something happened that no one has ever fully explained. They left him there. Confession in hand, immunity offered, the most damaging traitor in the history of British intelligence sitting in an apartment in Beirut. And SIS did not seize him, did not spirit him home, did not put a watch on the door he could not slip. Elliot went back to London. Philby was left at liberty in a foreign city, with the sea at his back and a Soviet apparatus that had never stopped watching over him. Whether it was arrogance or a wish to be rid of him without a trial that would humiliate the service, or a quiet hope that he would simply disappear and spare everyone the scandal, the effect was the same. On the night of 23 January 1963, Kim Philby disappeared. There was a dinner party he was expected at. He never arrived. Down at the harbor, in the winter dark, a Soviet freighter named the Dolmatova was preparing to sail. He went aboard. No passport control, no farewell, no trace. Only a ship slipping out past the breakwater and turning north, carrying the correspondent, the informant, the agent, the friend, away from every life he had ever pretended to live. It would be July before London admitted publicly that he was gone. By then he was in Moscow, and the Soviet Union had granted him citizenship. 30 years after a young man at Cambridge had chosen his side, he had finally, physically, crossed to it. He had won. He had gotten out. He had beaten them all. He had also, though he did not yet understand it, arrived at the loneliest place he would ever know. Part 8. The Hunters. The myth arrived in Moscow before Philby did. In the telling that spread through the West, the mole had come home in triumph, a general in the KGB, an office in the Lubyanka, a hand on the levers of Soviet intelligence, a hero rewarded at last with rank and power. It was a satisfying story. It let his enemies imagine that his treachery had at least purchased something real. Almost none of it was true. The service he had served for 30 years did not know what to do with him. He was not made a general. He was given no operational command, no desk, no agents to run. For years, the KGB kept him at arm's length, debriefed him, then debriefed him again, and set watchers on the man who had spent his life evading watchers. They could not be certain of him. He had deceived British intelligence for 3 decades. How could Moscow be sure he would not, one gray morning, decide to deceive them too and slip back the way he had come? The master of double lives was suspected, in the end, of the one thing he had made his life's work. He was a defector they could not entirely trust, so the triumph curdled into isolation. He drank. The famous charm had no one left to work on. He was cut off from language, from country, from the England he had betrayed and never stopped, in some buried way, belonging to. His wife Eleanor came to join him, and found not a hero of the Soviet state, but a lonely, drinking man in a foreign flat. And in 1965, she left him. There was an affair with Melinda McLean, the wife of Donald McLean, another of the Ring, another man rotting quietly in the same gray exile. The circle of betrayal had grown so tight that the traitors could now only betray each other. The depression was real, and it was long. The man who had held his nerve through Volkov and Beirut, and a career built entirely on lies, found that the lies had been the only warm thing he had, and now they were gone. and there was nothing behind them but a cold city and a language he could not read. It was Rufina who saved what was left. In 1971, he married Rufina Pukova, a Russian woman, and the marriage steadied his final years, gave them an ordinary human shape they had never had. Only later did the KGB thaw enough to use him, and even then modestly, a consultant, a lecturer, an old professional brought in to talk to young officers about the trade. The medals came, the Order of Lenin, the Order of the Red Banner, the Order of the Friendship of Peoples. He wore them without illusion. The Order of Lenin, he remarked, felt less like a knighthood than an OBE. Even his own honors he could not resist quietly deflating. In 1968, his memoir, My Silent War, appeared in the West. There was no repentance in it. There was no apology, no anguish, no reckoning. Only the calm, elegant self-justification of a man who insisted he had chosen his side young and served it faithfully to the end, and would do it all again. It was the most chilling thing about him, not that he had betrayed, but that he had never once, in all those years, wished he hadn't. He died on 11th May 1988 in Moscow, 76 years old. The Soviet Union gave him an honored funeral and buried him at Kuntsevo Cemetery. And in 1990, it issued a postage stamp bearing his face. The boy from the British establishment, embalmed at last as a Soviet hero on a square of Soviet paper. But the damage did not lie down in the grave with him. Across the Atlantic, one man never recovered. James "Jesus" Angleton had run counterintelligence for the CIA, and he had trusted Philby, had lunched with him in Washington, talked shop with him, admired him, called him a friend. When the truth came out, something in Angleton broke and never healed. If Philby could fool him, Philby, the charming Englishman across the lunch table, then anyone could be fooled, and anyone could be a traitor, and no one anywhere could be believed. He plunged the agency into a mole hunt that lasted for years and found no mole, only ruin. Careers destroyed on suspicion, defectors turned away as plants, operations frozen by the certainty that betrayal lurked behind every honest face. They gave that condition a name, the Wilderness of Mirrors, and Angleton wandered it until 1974, when he was finally forced out, having caught no spy but Philby's ghost, over and over, in every reflection. In Britain, it was the same disease under a different sky. The mole hunts ran on for years, suspicion climbing so high it eventually touched the very head of MI5. The trust between the British and American services, the trust on which the whole Western intelligence alliance had been built, had a hole blown through it that took a generation to patch, and never fully. One man had done that. One man had made two nations unable to believe their own. That was Philby's true legacy, not the documents, not the betrayed networks, not even the agents who died. It was the doubt. He became the permanent symbol of the enemy who is not at the gate, but at the table. The insider, the man of the right schools and the right accent in the right clubs, who used every advantage his country gave him to destroy it, and betrayed his class, his colleagues, his closest friends, and his nation, all of it, for an idea, and went to his grave without regret. His father had wanted him at the heart of the establishment. He got there, and from the very center of it for 30 years, he sent everything he touched to Moscow. They buried him at Kuntsevo under a Russian sky, an old man in a country that had never quite trusted him, honored by a state he had served better than it ever served him. Somewhere in a Western archive his file was closing, and somewhere in the minds of the men who had known him, the question would never close at all. The same question Nicholas Elliott must have carried home from Beirut, and Angleton to his grave, and the whole apparatus of two nations along with them. If Kim Philby could be a traitor, then who, truly, could you ever know?